Okay, shall we begin? Before we start the class today, can you name some of the international organizations that you know? Okay, thank you so much. I heard a lot of names, and I think that I hear United Nations a lot. And yeah, that's true because that organization is very popular, and you can see its appearance in every aspects of international relations, from the security to the economic development to the environmental protection. And I also hear other names like the ASEAN, right? Yeah, the organizations within our region, and also the EU. The EU is also a very popular name when it comes to the international organizations. Okay, so turn to the first content of the class today, some introduction to the international organization. I would like to introduce to you the history of international organizations. Well, despite the popularity of the United Nations, it is not the first international organization in the international community, even though the establishment of the UN indeed brought significant impacts on the emergence of international organizations. The idea of building an association among states to deal with mutual problems or to help each other in developing the economy was emerged from the 17th century with the Treaty of Westphalia, or the long-standing international organization that I think it is very familiar to you in high school with the Latin writing competition, the UPU. The UPU is short for the Universal Postal Union, established in 1865. And as of today, it is estimated that there are around 60,000 international organizations operating in different aspects with different scale. However, only 300 of them are intergovernmental organizations. So the concept of international organization in general can consist of any organization that spread its activities to many countries. However, in the class today, we will narrow the definition of the international organizations as follows. Okay, so move to the next part of this first content. We will go into the definition and characteristics of international organizations. So in this slide, you can see the definition provided by the International Law Committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations, or the ILC, on the draft articles on the responsibility of international organizations. So, international organizations is defined as an organization established by a treaty or other instruments governed by the international law and possessing its own international legal personality. International organizations may include as members in addition to states, other entities. Okay, so let's take a minute or two to, read carefully to this definition and point out some characteristics may arising from this definition. Okay, so we're going back to the definition. You can see in this definition a very typical characteristic of the international organization is that it is limited only to those whose members are states, or in other words, within the scope of this lesson, we will only study on intergovernmental organizations. So it means that any other international organizations, especially the NGO, the non-governmental organizations, will not be included in this lesson. So it gives you the first characteristic of international organizations, or it must be an association of states, or in order for an international organization to become a subject of international law, it must be an association of the most important subject of international law, states. So therefore, in many documents, they also call international organizations a derivative subject of international law. And the second characteristic is that it must have a conventional basis, or it must have a treaty concluding among state members regulating the structures or the activities of that international organization. And this characteristic aims to ensure that the international organizations are governed by international law. So, like the United Nations, they have the UN Charter, or with the WTO, the World Trade Organization, they have a series of treaties regulating different aspects of the relations among the members of that organizations. And last but not least is the third characteristic of international organization that you can see in this definition is that even though the international organizations are established on the basis of states, it still have its own international legal personality. So what is the international legal personality? So let's move to the next part of these lessons. So in order to study further on the international legal personality of international organizations, I would like to introduce to you the ICJ advisory opinion on reparation for injuries suffered in the service of the UN. Well, in September 1948, the United Nations mediator in Palestine and other members of the United Nations mission to Palestine were assassinated in Jerusalem. And after the incident, the General Assembly has submitted a request of an advisory opinion to the ICJ to ask the court whether the United Nations had the capacity to bring an international claim against the state responsible with a view to obtaining reparation for damage caused to the organization and to the victim. Now I will help you to clarify the question and also the answers coming with it. So the United Nations General Assembly question has two parts. The first part is whether the United Nations had the capacity to bring an international claim against the state responsible with a view to obtain reparation for damage caused to the organization. And the second part is whether the United Nations had the capacity to bring an international claim against the state responsible with a view to obtain reparation for damage caused to the victim. And regarding the second part of the question, its part is a little bit complicated because it has a problem is the conflict between the protection of the organization of which the victim is a member and the country of which the victim is a national. So the latter case might be more familiar to you because it concerns the diplomatic protection or the relationship between a country and the victim who is national. And it is a very traditional concept with the foundation is the nationality, yet the link between the victim and the state. And the complicated part of this question is about the former case, is about the relationship between an international organization and its agent who is also the victim of the incident. And in this former case, the ICJ introduced the concept of functional protection. It focuses in the link, which is the function entrusted to the victim by the international organization. And with this part, the answer of the ICJ is yes. The international organization can bring the international claim to obtain the reparation for damage caused to its agents. And the ICJ also clarified that when there is a conflict arising from the diplomatic and the functional protection, an agreement between the state and the international organization concerned will be needed to settle, so there is no model settlement for that conflict, but it's based on the case-by-case basis, so a separate agreement will be needed. And in conclusion, the advisory opinion of the ICJ concerning the reparation request of the United Nations to the victim as its agent had said that the international organization like the United Nations, they has the international legal personality, or in other words, like the states, they have the capacity to bring an international claim against another state. And in the last part, we will take a look at the classification of international organization. And we can classify international organizations into three categories by its members, functions, and the scope of activities. So based on the members, we could have some global international organizations like the United Nations or the World Trade Organizations whose members can be any states. And we also have regional organizations. We have the EU, the European Union, the OAS, the Organizations of American States. We have the AU, the African Union, or our organization, the ASEAN. And we can also have inter-regional organizations like the OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. And regarding the functions, we can have many international organizations with one or multiple functions. Like we have the one with the functions is collecting information or monitoring trends. We have the World Meteorological Organization, or some other with the function is to deliver services and aid, like the World Health Organization, or organizations whose function is to provide forums for bargaining, like the European Union, or in function in settling dispute, like the World Trade Organization. And by providing political institutions through which states can work together to achieve common objectives, international organization can help to foster cooperative behavior. And if we divide the international organizations based on the scope of activities, we will have the one with general scope activities like the UN or regional organizations. Like the UN, you can see that their scope activities spread from the security to economic development and also other aspects of international relations like the protection of environment or protection of human rights. And we also have other international organizations with specific scope of activities, like if we're talking about trade, we're talking about the WTO, we're talking about the intellectual property, we have the WIPO, or if it concerns with the right to health, we have the World Health Organization, or the right to work, we have the International Labour Organization. Okay, so to wrap up the first part of this lesson, the introduction to the international organizations, let's review to some points that we have learned so far. The first is about the history of international organizations. We have learned that the UN, even though it's not the first international organization, but it's a very important one, and it plays a very vital role in inspiring the emergence of international organizations. And then we have take a look at the definition and characteristic of international organizations to realize that the international organizations within the scope of these lessons contains only the one whose member are states. And then we have read the case on the international legal personality of the United Nations in order to know that the international organizations do have the international legal personality like states. And lastly, we have go through the classification of international organizations based on its members, functions, and scope of activities. Okay, so let's move to the next part of the lessons, the law of international organizations.